The Earth. H. E. Bates. H. E. Bates, 1905–1974, born at Northampton in central England, was well acquainted with the English countryside, especially the peasants who lived there. A well-known short story writer, he worked for some time as a journalist. His first novel was published when he was only 21 years old. He wrote many short stories about airmen and their adventures based on his experiences in the Royal Air Force. His important works include Fair Stood the Wind for France, 1944, The Purple Plain, 1947, The Jacaranda Tree, 1949, The Scarlet Sword, 1951 and The Darling Buds of May, 1958. The present short story, The Earth, set in the English countryside, is about a farmer Johnson and his son Benji, who appears to be a simple-minded person. The story very well depicts the laziness of the parents and the growing selfishness and cunningness of their simple-minded son, who finally drives them away from their home. All that the Johnsons had was the earth. Very often it seemed as if it were all they had ever had. It was true that they also had possessions: a plough, a two-wheeled cart, tools, a bony brown mare which slowly dragged the plough and the cart about their rough 4-acre plot, but without the earth these things were useless. It was true that they also had a son. The Johnsons' son was named Benji, and it was more than 30 years since they had surrendered to the idea that he was not right in his head. It was not that he was insane or imbecile, or even that he could not read and write and count figures, but only that he was simple, not quite like other people. And because he was their only son, the Johnsons had spent many years being a little too kind, too anxious and too sacrificial towards him, so that he had grown up to seem worse, in their eyes, than he really was. Benji had the large loose limbs that often belong to the simple-minded, and thick soft fair hair on his face. He had the look of being a simple-hearted man as well as a simple-minded man. His eyes were blue, and all day long he had a simple smile on his face. But somewhere behind the blue eyes, the simple smile, and the soft childish hair, his simplicity seemed gradually to have become a kind of cunning. It was more than 30 years since the Johnsons, realizing that he was not quite like others, had taken Benji to a doctor. This doctor had persuaded him that he needed interests that would strengthen his mind. It would be good if they gave him something to do, some occupation, which would help his development. It would help a great deal if they gave him a special interest, to feed his sense of responsibility. You are people on the land, the doctor said, let him keep hens. So for many years Benji had kept hens, and what the earth was to his mother and father, the hens were to Benji. They were almost all he had. When he came from school, cut off by his simplicity from other children, Benji went straight home to his hens, which he kept in a wire co-op that his father had made at the back of the house. At first he kept 10 or a dozen hens, all colors and breeds, brown and speckled and black and white, and the co-op was small. He fed the hens simply, on scraps from the table, seeded cabbages strung from the wire, a little maize, and on corn ears which he gleaned in the late summer from his father's acre of stubble. It is possible that a hen, being a simple creature, thrives best on simple treatment. Benji understood the first and last thing about a hen, that it exists for the purpose of laying eggs. In those days this simple process had not become scientific, nor had it become highly complicated and commercialized. Eggs were cheap, hens mysteriously pecked nourishment off the bare earth. They sat in a homemade nesting box, on straw, and laid the eggs expected of them. Benji understood another thing about the business of hens, and that was that eggs could be sold to callers at the back door of their house, in scores and half-scores and fivers, and the money from these eggs was put carefully, almost religiously, into a large white basin that stood on the top shelf of the kitchen cupboard. The basin was beyond Benji's reach. But one day, his mother would tell him, "The money will be yours. You understand? Your father and me are going to save the money. When there's enough, we shall put it in the bank. The bank will give interest on it, and then one day, when you're 21, it will be yours by rights. It'll all be yours and you can do what you like with it. Do you understand?" And Benji would simply smile at his mother and say yes, he understood. As time went on, Benji began to keep many more hens. Soon there were more eggs than could be sold at the back door, and by the time Benji had left school at 14 he had 40 or 50 hens and about as many laying pullets, and these were producing an average of 200 eggs a week. Soon he would set off 3 times a week with a large basket of eggs on a wheeled truck, and hawk them in Castor, the nearest town. By this time the money no longer went into the basin, but straight into the bank. Benji could read, and a year or 2 afterwards he read in a paper that it was better to segregate breeds of hens, keeping white leghorns separate from Rhode Islands, and young from old. This meant new coops, and at the same time Benji read that hens needed air and exercise and dry hygienic places to sleep. Benji was very strong and understood a simple thing like nailing wire netting to wood, and began himself to build new houses and coops for the new, segregated breeds of hens. For all of this he needed space, and so his father and mother gave him a strip of land running from the back of the house halfway across the field. In this way they gave him something more precious than they had ever given before. For the first time, without fully realizing it, they gave him a piece of the earth. All this time they themselves had struggled hard and almost vainly with the earth. At the back of their minds lay a precious belief that Benji would one day grow out of his simplicity. In the same way they cherished a silent belief that the earth would one day outgrow its poverty. The earth had yielded stubbornly for them, and the reason, like Benji, was simple. The reason was not in the earth, but in themselves. For most of their lives they had put rather more value on faith than sweat. For many years Benji's father had been a local preacher, a man with quite a gift of talking. He liked not only to talk on Sundays, to village congregations in small still chapels far out in the countryside, but he liked to talk at the back door, over the field gate, in the road outside the house. He talked so much that he must have had an idea that the earth, designed, created, and nourished by God, would take care of itself. While he talked, thistles seeded and choked his wheat, rabbits broke in and gnawed his cabbages, storms smashed his standing corn. He struggled on like a man chained by bad luck, and while he knew that his land was poor and that Benji was a simple man, no one had ever had the need or courage to tell him that he himself was a lazy man with too large a trust in Providence. And while his father talked, Benji went on steadfastly with the simple business of making hens lay eggs. Part of the field at the back of his father's house began to resemble a quivering checkerboard of black and brown and white feathers. For a long time now the eggs had been too many for the wheeled truck, and Benji at regular intervals borrowed his father's horse and cart, taking the eggs not only down into the town but also into market. All the time Benji wore the simple smile of a simple-hearted man on his face, and all the time the money went religiously into the bank in his name. When Benji was 21, his mother and father planned and carried out a little ceremony. They got his passbook from the bank, and at supper his father made a sort of speech, almost in the tone of a public address, in which he talked as if he had been a diligent man all his life, setting an example of thrift and industry, and that this, the passbook, was Benji's natural reward for following it. He talked as if he were talking to a child who still does not know 1 from 2, and at last he gave Benji the passbook. "This is your money, Benji," he said. "Now you're 21. This is your money. Do you understand?" "Yes," Benji said, and he took the passbook. He opened it and looked at it, and saw in it an amount of more than £230. Then he shut up the passbook and put it into his pocket. Benji's mother and father did not speak. A strange tremor of a peculiar emotion went through them both, a mixture of disappointment, fear, pride, and pain. The amount in Benji's passbook was more than they themselves had ever amassed from the earth in their lives. They did not hope and did not mean that Benji should give it back to them, but there was something about the silent, simple finality of his putting the passbook into his pocket that struck them like a blow in the face. They had expected something else. A word of thanks, perhaps a concession, a willingness that they should share the money they had helped to save. It hurt them momentarily that Benji should appear so completely indifferent to them and to all they felt. Then they remembered why it was. It was because Benji was still simple. There were shades of feeling and conduct that were beyond his understanding. They were touched with pity for him, and understood. "What are you going to do with the money?" they said. "I'm going to buy a piece of land," Benji said. "Lands?" they said. "What land? Where?" "Mr. Whitmore wants to sell the 4 acres next to us," Benji said. "But, Benji," they said. "How did you know? How did you find out?" Benji had a very simple answer. "I asked Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Well," they said, "that is a very good idea. A wonderful good idea. You couldn't do anything better." As time went on, and Benji acquired the land, his father and mother not only felt that it was a good idea but they felt very proud of him. They had that kind of pride in him that parents have in a child that says its first word or takes its first step. Benji, a simple-minded man, had taken his first step in normal, adult things. It was wonderful, too, that he had taken the step without help, without force or prompting. All his life they had treated him as a child that will not grow up, and now, suddenly, he had grown up. Though they could scarcely realize it. Benji was a man of property. For the next 4 or 5 years Benji went on creating more houses for more hens, and then selling more eggs and making more money. He was still a simple man. He could not have made a pair of boots. He knew nothing about the stock markets. But he knew everything about a hen. His hens were still to him what the earth was to his parents. All he had, and all he understood. There was only one difference between Benji's hens and his parents' land. The hens belonged to Benji. The land had never belonged to his parents, who had rented it now for 40 years, on a yearly tenancy, from a man named Sanders. They had often spoken of buying the land, but somehow the scheme never came to anything. It was easier for Benji's father to stand at the door and talk, or to talk in the pulpit and trust in God, than to make a business proposition. And now, at 65, they were too old to think of buying land, even if there had been any money for buying land. And suddenly the land was for sale, their land, their earth, which was all they had. The town was spreading, the man named Sanders said, and everywhere people wanted land for building. Either he must sell the land for building, or he must sell the land to them. They felt lost and distracted. They had lived a vague, trusting life without system, with a simple-minded son to rear, with an infinite faith in God but with little or no faith in fertilizers. As a result, they had nothing. Even the earth, which they had regarded as inviolate, was not theirs, and was about to be taken away from them. Deeply and painfully upset, they went to the man named Sanders, and told him how it was. "I don't see no way of getting the money," Benji's father said. "So we must get out at Michaelmas. That's all. Don't you worry," Sanders said. "Don't surprise me you can't see your way to do it. But I can tell you this, if you can't buy it, somebody not far away will. Who'll buy it?" they said. "Benji," he said. They went home feeling that this was the supremely important moment of their lives. It seemed like the moment of reward. If their faith had been shaken, it was now completely whole again. They saw that there could be joy and satisfaction and ultimate good, even in the raising of a simple-minded son. "We never knew, Benji. We never even suspected," they said. "What made you do it? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to put up more incubator houses," Benji said. Again, as when they had given Benji the passbook, they did not speak. They had expected something else, without quite knowing what. A word, a small concession perhaps, an assurance that things would go on as before. But there was nothing, only the same simple finality as when Benji had taken possession of the passbook. They were momentarily pained. Then they knew, again, why it was. There are some things which are forgivable to a simple-minded man. The simple-minded, as they knew quite well, do not always understand. By this time Benji was almost 40, and it was only to them that he remained a simple-minded man. As his new hygienic chicken houses began to cover first one strip of his father's former land and then another, with the grey patches of hen dung eating their way into the brown-tilled earth, he began to be the largest poultry farmer on that side of the town. In appearance he had changed too. Always big-limbed, he had now become rather fat. His eyes were still a simple blue, and soft fair hair still grew thickly on his face, but now, set in fat flesh, the eyes seemed much smaller. They were no longer the eyes of a simple-minded man. They were the eyes of a man who, in a simple way, is quite cunning. No one but Benji, at this time, knew how many hens and chickens he possessed. No one knew how many eggs the collective system lorries fetched from him every week. No one knew the amount of his passbook. It was possible to gauge his progress only by the new chicken houses covering his father's former land, and by the fact that he now employed people to help him. One of these people was a girl named Florence. She had thick heavy legs and loose lips and unreflective grey eyes that matched Benny's in their apparent simplicity. When Florence bent down to clean the chicken houses, which were raised up off the ground, Benji could see a gap of bare flesh above her grey stockings or the shadows of deep breasts beneath her smock. In a little while Benji was catching Florence about the waist in the warm dark incubator houses, and for the first time in his life he had some other interest besides hens. It became clear to him that his father and mother did not like Florence, this simple, undistinguished girl with ugly legs and a mouth that would not keep shut. But Benji did not need a distinguished, intelligent girl, even if one would have looked at him. He needed a woman to help with the hens, and soon he was saying that he and Florence would be married. As with the passbook and the lad, his father and mother were not prepared for that. Married? Aren't you all right as you are? Don't you want time to consider it? Where are you going to live? Here, Benji said. And that autumn, at the end of his 40th year, Benji moved into the house with Florence as his wife. We'll want the front bedroom, Benji said. All their lives his father and mother had slept in the front bedroom. Now they vacated it and moved into the back. This removal hurt them deeply. But because it was now Benji's house, because Benji asked it, they moved without protest, adding a little more to the long chronicle of sacrifice, forgiving Benji because the simple-minded cannot be expected to understand. But the problem of the girl was different. It seemed to them that the girl was about to take Benji away from them. The air in the house became charged deeply with antagonism, the house itself invisibly but clearly divided. And then presently it became divided in actuality. Up to that time the four people had eaten together. Suddenly Benji's mother did not like the way Florence scoured the saucepans. I always scour them with soda. Soda's always been good enough for me and always will. When Benji heard of the quarrel he had a very simple solution. That settles it, he said. Now you eat in the kitchen, and we'll eat in the other room. And throughout that winter Benji and his wife lived in one part of the house, and his father and mother in the other. To the old people the days began now to seem very long, and as they looked out on the land they could see the reason, where there had once been brown bare earth, rows of winter beans, patches of wheat, there were now only Benji's chicken houses. The earth was still there, but the purpose of it no longer concerned them. The plow, the mare, the cart, and their few tools stood about in the yard, but now it was truer than ever that without the earth they were useless. As the winter went on, and the four people were more and more confined indoors, the division in the house became an enormous gap. The two women passed each other on the stairs with glances of antagonism, nor speaking. When Benji's father walked out to preach on Sundays he walked slowly and brokenly, with the steps of an old man. Only Benji appeared not to be upset. Preoccupied with his hens, it was as if the emotions of normal people never penetrated beyond his plump hairy face and the eyes that looked so harmless and simple still. But in the end it was Benji who made the decision. Mum and Dad, he said, it would be lot better if you went somewhere else to live. Benji, they said. A lot better, he said. This is our house now. We want it. I bought the house, and I want it now. Benji, I bought it and I want it, Benji said again. I want you to go. Benji, we can't go, his mother said. We got nowhere to go. We got nowhere. You've got to get out. Benji shouted. As he shouted they realized, more fully than at any time in their lives, that Benji was really not right in his head. His simple blue eyes were shot suddenly with a wild expression of insane anger. They not only knew that Benji was a simple-minded man who was not fully responsible for his actions, but for the first time, struck by this wild-eyed burst of anger, they were frightened of Benji too. "All right," they said, "we'll find some way to go." It was little more than a week later when Benji drove his mother and father down into the town. He now had a small Ford van, and as he drove the van, with his mother and father on the driving seat, he showed no sign of normal emotion. It was clear that he did not understand the meaning of affection, of bewilderment, or of despair. He felt and spoke and thought only in the simplest terms, with the cruel simplicity of a child. "You'll be better by yourselves in lodgings," he said. "You'll be better by yourselves." They did not answer. They sat with faces made completely immobile by a kind of stupefied resignation very near to grief. They listened silently and, because for 40 years they had believed Benji to be not right in his head, they made allowances for the last time. Down in the town the car stopped in a street filled entirely with houses. Benji did not get out of the van. His father's and mother's belongings had already gone on and now they alighted empty-handed. As they stood on the pavement Benji spoke a few words to them, looked at them with unmoved simple eyes, and then drove away. When the van had gone they stood alone on the pavement, looking at the ground. They stood as if they had alighted in a strange place, were not sure of themselves, and did not know what to do. Once they had had the earth. Now it was not possible to tell, from the downcast and silent faces, whether they altogether realized that it, too, had gone.